Hello everyone, Ace here, and today let's talk about the upcoming War Fantasy, a game made by a single developer that is touted as being a deconstruction of military-themed FPS games, on the grounds that they desensitize people towards real-world violence, and thus make them susceptible to being recruited by the military. The one thing that can be said is true is the fact that the military have used video games as a recruitment tool. However, even with that concession, the effectiveness of that, which is to say the number of people that played America's Army back in the day and decided specifically because they played that game that they were going to join the military as a direct result, well, to say that the evidence backs that up is not really accurate at all. There's a reason the US Army, and indeed the military as a whole, has moved away from making its own video games as recruitment tools. They've instead more or less latched onto existing IP franchises where possible these days, with their esports teams and what have you. And once again, being as charitable as possible, the effectiveness of that as a strategy is very debatable. Case in point, yes, it is true that military recruitment is currently up in the current year of 2026, yet this is occurring at a time when modern military-themed FPS games are not exactly the juggernauts that they once were within the industry. COD has gained a reputation of being, well, frankly, mediocre since the days of Ghosts, and that came out well over a decade ago at this point. Okay, you could argue that there have been some decent games here and there since, yet the glory days of COD as a franchise have been over for a while. And again, this is even seen with the military-themed FPS genre as a whole, what with more FPS games that are major hitters steering away from that. Of course, Call of Duty and also Battlefield as competitor aren't exactly immune to that either. Both franchises have made a number of games in the past decade that have veered specifically away from modern-themed FPS, even if they still have modern-themed FPS entries, and a good number of them at that. But here's the big point that I'm making here, the main thrust of my argument, and that is the fact that there is currently the opposite of correlation between recruitment numbers in the military in the year of 2026, as opposed to the current trends within the video game industry towards military-themed FPS games. Instead of seeing the numbers of military-themed FPS games in terms of popularity going up the way that recruitment numbers currently are, instead that popularity has been on the decline overall. And likewise, instead of seeing military recruitment numbers actually being down the way that popularity for military-themed FPS games currently are, those recruitment numbers are actually up, exceeding expectations. If what the premise of War Fantasy presents is actually accurate, we would expect the exact opposite. We would see a direct correlation that can be clearly tracked between the popularity of military-themed FPS games and recruitment numbers within the military. So the fact this is not the case shows that the entire core premise behind the game is faulty. Even if you want to argue that it's only critiquing the military's use of video games as a recruitment tool, the ineffectiveness of the military in actually accomplishing that, or at the very least, the ineffectiveness in military-themed FPS games in accomplishing additional recruitment for the military, shows that the way that the game developer is going about it is simply not meshing with reality. Technically, an effective critique could be made towards the military's use of video games as a recruiting tool, but that critique would ultimately be that it doesn't work. That you don't have legions of people joining the military because they played America's Army back in the day, or because they saw the US Army esports team playing. The problem is, should the developer go down that particular route, they'd ultimately be defeating the premise of their game in the first place, leading us back to square one. But the ineffectiveness of the military using video games as a recruiting tool is not the only critique that I can bring up to counter the premise behind War Fantasy. There are even studies that have been done with MRI scans that demonstrate that no, video gamers do not actually become desensitized towards real-life violence by playing violent video games. And let's keep ripping the band-aid right off, because the idea that the US military can successfully utilize video games, and violent video games at that, to brainwash people into joining the military ultimately is, like it or not, built upon the premise that video games desensitize people towards real-life violence. Unless you want to argue that most civilians think of the military through the non-combat roles as opposed to the combat roles, and very good luck trying to actually make that argument that that's somehow what most civilians think of when they think of the military. But ignoring that obvious and blatantly false argument and premise, it is apparent that getting people to join the military does mean getting people that are comfortable with the possibility that they may have to face combat, or at the very least they are willing to accept that as a possibility. Thus, for obvious reasons, trying to utilize video games as a recruitment tool would at least necessitate the idea that video games desensitize people towards real-world violence, effectively increasing the pool of people willing to accept that as a possible outcome. So the fact that there are studies, once again, that show through MRI scans that this is not the case demonstrates a very glaring hole in the central premise behind utilizing video games as a military recruitment tool. And for those of you who are concerned that the study only focused on people that have never experienced violent video games and are therefore a unique demographic, what with the sheer prevalence of violent video games in today's society, at least within Western nations, the scientists behind the study were concerned about that possibility as well and ran their test against an additional control group who have, of course, played violent video games in the past, proving that no, this is not the result of picking a demographic that is more morally conscious or something. Instead, the fact that violent video games do not desensitize people towards real-world violence can also be tracked upon the general population as well. Now, some people here may be thinking that I'm being a little bit too hard on the project of War Fantasy. After all, the dev behind it also worked on Call of Duty, so he has inside knowledge and clearly knows what he's talking about. This is clearly a product of him developing Call of Duty and becoming disillusioned by what he has seen as an end result. This is him redeeming himself, right? Except that's not actually the case at all. In reality, he lists himself being rejected by several major publishers, by a woman, and also him listing Trump as winning the 2016 election as being what pushed him to make War Fantasy. So yes, this is a woke developer who got so butthurt over Trump winning in 2016 that he has decided to develop this game ever since. He is that obsessed and mentally damaged by Trump winning 2016, by his own admission. And as for him being a Call of Duty dev, well, that only occurred after he was working on War Fantasy. In fact, he ended up working on Call of Duty, briefly, specifically because they saw his work on War Fantasy. He also, by the way, tried to secure funding from a grant from the Canadian government, only to be turned down because his game wasn't good enough. And considering the kind of slop that Western governments have been known to fund, that's a damning statement if there ever was one. So at the end of the day, what's being hyped is a game developed by a guy who's only a Call of Duty dev because he worked on War Fantasy prior, rather than it being the other way around, as a lot of sources are misleading people into believing by omitting how exactly he briefly became a Call of Duty developer. Then of course there's the fact that War Fantasy itself was created in part because Trump won 2016 and the developer was butthurt as a result. And to top it all off, the core premise behind the game that all of the game journalists are getting excited for is not only fundamentally flawed to the very core, but there are actively statistics and studies out there that utterly refute it. Video games do not desensitize people towards real-life violence. And the effectiveness of recruiting within the United States military does not directly correlate with the popularity of military-themed FPS games. Even if you want to take up the position that the military does try to recruit people through that method, the actual ineffectiveness that has been put on display for all to see, which is to say the general lack of correlation, does demonstrate a level of ignoring reality that is required for the message behind War Fantasy.